In the mid-10th century, Princess Olga of Kiev avenged her husband's death with a ruthless campaign that reads like a real-life medieval epic saga. Over the course of a few fateful years, Olga orchestrated one of history's most legendary acts of revenge. This was a sequence so dramatic and brutal that it secured her place in history even as it paved the way for her son's future reign. Paradoxically, this same Olga would later be hailed as a bringer of faith and canonized as a saint. To put it in a pop culture context, the series of acts that made her famous was like watching the Red Wedding crossed with South Park's Scott Tenorman Must Die, only it actually happened. Frankly, though, if someone pitched her story of vengeance in a writer's room, they'd be told to tone it down. It's just too unhinged to be believable. Our story begins with a betrayal in the deep woods of the Eastern European frontier, where Norse Viking descendants had carved out a vast territory. In the year 945, Olga's husband, Prince Igor of Kiev, rode out to collect tribute from a neighboring Slavic tribe known as the Drevlians. Relations between the Kievan Rus and the Drevlians had always been uneasy. The Drevlians once paid tribute to Igor's predecessors, but had rebelled against Kiev's authority after the death of an earlier ruler. Determined to assert control, Igor initially forced them to submit and pay up, but greed or a sense of insufficient justice overtook him. As he and his men headed home, Igor unwisely turned back with only a small escort to demand more tribute. This decision proved fatal. In what would end up as a very gruesome turn, the Drevlians ambushed Igor and captured him. Later chronicles described a particularly brutal method of execution. Igor was captured, tied to the tops of two bent-over birch trees, and then torn apart by the kinetic energy as the trunks were released. Prince Mal, leader of the Drevlians, had effectively thrown down a gauntlet. Back in Kiev, Princess Olga received the shattering news that her husband was dead, and she was now a widow, with a 3-year-old son, Sviatoslav, to protect. Olga suddenly found herself ruling the Kievan Rus as regent for young Sviatoslav. Unsurprisingly, far from appeasing the Drevlians, Igor's death emboldened them. Sensing an opportunity, the Drevlian Prince Mal decided to seize power in the region, and he knew just how he could do it. Prince Mal had it on really good authority that a major player in the area was newly widowed, and he was about to slide into her vast holdings and maybe even dispossess her son. If he could marry Olga, he would not only control Kiev, but also the heir, Sviatoslav. It was a bold and arrogant proposal, essentially asking the widow to wed the very man behind her husband's slaying. To deliver this proposal, the Drevlians dispatched a boat of envoys to Kiev, unaware that their actions were setting into motion Olga's carefully plotted vengeance. A Drevlian longboat arrived at the docks of Kiev, carrying 20 of Prince Mal's ambassadors. Olga greeted these envoys with an outward show of civility. Hiding her fury, she listened as they brazenly announced that they had eliminated her husband and now proposed that she marry their eligible prince. Many rulers might have exploded in rage or ordered the envoys' immediate removal, but Olga chose a different path, one of subtle deception followed by a short burst of extreme violence. She told the Drevlians that their proposal was indeed pleasing to her. After all, her husband was dead and couldn't be brought back to life. Olga even hinted that she accepted the offer of marriage, and implied that while her husband was strong, it would have taken a real man to take him out. That sort of man was the only sort of man she could marry, a real tough guy like Prince Mal of the Drevlians. However, she said, such distinguished visitors deserve to be honored properly in front of her people. She calmly instructed the envoys to return to their boat for the night and come back the next day, and to insist on being carried in their boat when brought to her presence. Puzzled but satisfied by her polite response, The Drevlian envoys followed her instructions, likely congratulating themselves on an easy conquest. What followed was anything but an engagement celebration. Overnight, Olga had her people dig a huge trench inside the courtyard of her palace. The next day, as planned, the envoys proudly demanded to be carried in their boat as a mark of honor, and Olga's people hoisted the Drevlian boat, envoys sitting inside, on their shoulders. With great fanfare, the boat was marched into the palace courtyard. The envoys may have felt triumphant, thinking the conquered populace was treating them like nobility being carried on a royal palanquin. In truth, they were being carried to their doom. Upon Olga's signal, the bearers tipped the boat into the open trench. In an instant, the 20 Drevlian ambassadors found themselves at the bottom of a pit, trapped. Olga's men began shoveling earth into the trench without mercy, burying the Drevlians alive while the princess looked on from above the pit. It's said that Olga leaned over to ask if they found this honor to their liking. The envoys' proud smiles turned to screams, then silence, as Olga exacted the first measure of her revenge. But yeah, Olga was a Viking princess living on the Russian frontier, and this was just Act 1 in a multi-part feast of vengeance she was going to thoroughly enjoy. By wiping out Prince Maul's first diplomatic mission so covertly, Olga had removed the immediate threat and buried them quite literally under her nose. However, the Drevlians back home had no clue that their ambassadors had met such a fate, and no messenger returned to tell the tale. Olga intended to keep it that way, as she prepared the next act of retribution. With the initial envoys secretly dead and buried, Olga sent word to the prince that she had accepted his proposal of marriage, but with a small request. She asked him to send a delegation of his best men, the highest-ranking nobles and elders of the Drevlians, to accompany her on the journey to their land. These distinguished men, she claimed, would serve as her escort and ensure that she arrived to the Drevlian capital with due honor before the wedding. Unsuspecting of the gruesome fate of the first embassy, Prince Maul and his council welcomed Olga's apparently favorable reply. Eager to seal the alliance, they gathered a second delegation of Drevlians, this time the very nobles and elders who governed their land, and dispatched them to Kiev as requested. When this second Drevlian entourage arrived in Kiev, Olga greeted them warmly and invited them to refresh themselves after their long journey. She suggested that the men bathe in her private bathhouse before meeting her, as a gesture of hospitality. One can imagine the relief and joy of these Drevlian nobles. Not only had Olga graciously agreed to marry their prince, she was treating them with the respect due to high dignitaries. The Drevlians entered the bathhouse, likely a wooden building that was heated and steamy, expecting comfort. But Olga's hospitality was a deadly ruse. As soon as the last man was inside and had let his guard down, Olga's guards barred the doors from the outside. At Olga's command, they set the bathhouse ablaze. Trapped within, the entire Drevlian delegation was burned alive in a roaring inferno. The very leaders of the Drevlian tribe perished in moments, consumed by flames as Olga exacted a second, even more devastating blow. By the time the smoke cleared, Prince Maul's realm had lost many of its most influential men, without a single battle. Olga had now avenged Igor not once, but twice, and still her wrath wasn't sated. Having eliminated 2 waves of Drevlians through trickery, Olga continued to feign willingness to marry Prince Maul. She sent another message to the Drevlian king, this time with a very different tone. She informed Prince Maul that before she could journey to his capital, she wanted to hold a proper funeral feast for her late husband Igor on Drevlian soil. This would be to honor his memory at the place he was slain, and also to make sure the whole thing wasn't too unseemly. As a future wife, she argued, It was only right that she pay her respects and formally mourn her former spouse. To make it convincing, Olga requested that the Drevlians prepare a large quantity of mead in the city of Iskorostan, the Drevlian capital where Igor had been slain. This was ostensibly so that a grand funeral feast could take place upon her arrival and to honor her late husband. Prince Mal agreed, likely pleased that Olga seemed to be finally coming to his city after all his attempts. Olga traveled to Drevlian territory with a small retinue of her loyal retainers, all showing no signs of hostility. They were well armed, of course, but they were the retainers of Prince Mal's future wife, and at any rate, they were heavily outnumbered. True to her word, she visited Igor's grave and wept for her husband, displaying the expected grief of a widow. The Drevlians joined her in this funeral banquet. After all, they had to show honor to their new future queen. As the ritual feast progressed, the Drevlians indulged in the great quantities of mead they had prepared. Cups and horns of the sweet brew flowed freely, and soon the Drevlian mourners and guards grew drunk and unwary. This is exactly what Olga had planned. When she judged that the Drevlians were intoxicated and defenseless, she gave the signal. Suddenly, Olga's attendants drew their weapons and fell upon the drunken and passed out Drevlians, literally chopping them to pieces. Olga herself strode among the melee, urging on her followers to ensure no Drevlian was spared in this surprise massacre, and perhaps getting her hands dirty herself. According to the primary chronicle of the Kievan Rus, 5,000 Drevlians were slain during this bloody feast. The carnage was so complete that by the next morning, the fields of Iskorostan were littered with the bodies of those who had unwittingly become so incapacitated in front of the princess. The fate of Prince Mal himself is unknown, but whatever the case, his power was broken and he vanished from history, and most believe he was cut down in the fighting. Olga had decimated the Drevlian leadership and fighting force in one master stroke, all under the guise of a funeral tribute. With this third act of vengeance, one might assume Olga's thirst for retribution was finally quenched. Yet the Princess of Kiev was not finished. She returned home to raise an army, determined to deliver a final punishment to the Drevlians that would burn their name into memory. In the aftermath of the massacre, the surviving Drevlians recoiled to their fortified towns, terrified and leaderless. Olga wasted no time mustering the army of the Kievan Rus. With her young son Sviatoslav by her side, she marched against the remaining Drevlian strongholds, in what I can only describe as a medieval Russian take-your-kid-to-work day. The two forces clashed in open battle, and Olga's troops defeated the Drevlians in the field. Legend holds that the toddler Sviatoslav even took part in the first skirmish by tossing a tiny spear in the general direction of the combat. The vanquished Drevlians retreated behind the walls of Iskorostan, their capital city and the very place where Igor had been slain, and the bloody banquet took place. There, Olga's forces laid siege to the city, determined to crush the Drevlians once and for all. For a year, Iskorostan withstood Olga's siege. The city's defenses held, even as hunger and desperation grew within. Frustrated by the stalemate, Olga conceived one final ingenious trick, an endgame to exact total revenge. She sent a message into the besieged city offering terms, saying that the other Drevlian towns were being governed well, and the people were safe. Olga wasn't above telling a bit of a fib after all. Suspicious, the Drevlians answered that they feared she would never forgive their crime against Igor. Olga, who had already annihilated thousands, replied that those earlier deaths were vengeance enough and that she would ask only a token of tribute from the city. The exhausted Drevlians were prepared to give treasure, furs, or whatever she demanded. To their surprise, Olga's request seemed absurdly small. She asked each household in the city to hand over 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows. This symbolic tribute, she claimed, would show their submission and suffice as payment, given the hard year they had endured under siege. Like the birds they gave up, they wouldn't be free anymore, but they would be alive and not starving. Relieved at the cheap price for their lives, the people of Iskarostan happily complied. From every home they gathered pigeons and sparrows and sent them out to Olga's camp. But the token tribute was a carefully laid trap. Olga's soldiers took each bird and carefully tied a scrap of sulfur-bound cloth to its leg on a long string. When night fell, Olga gave the order, and flames flickered to life on the feet of thousands of birds. Released all at once, the pigeons and sparrows instinctively flew back to their nests and coops inside the city walls, carrying fire with them on these long strings. In moments, rooftops and haylofts ignited, and the wooden city of Iskarostan burst into flames from within, as if the very sky had rained fire. Panicked inhabitants rushed out as fire engulfed every corner of the city, too sudden and widespread to quench. Olga's waiting army moved in swiftly, and as you may have expected by this point in this story, no mercy was given. Thus, at last, Olga of Kiev fulfilled one of the most epic historical tales of vengeance ever. The revenge was so absolute and devastating that it ensured no Drevlian would ever dare challenge the Kievan Rus again. Having utterly subjugated the Drevlians, Olga turned her focus to ruling and rebuilding. Olga also steadfastly refused remarriage proposals, safeguarding the throne for Sviatoslav until he came of age. Her regency lasted until around 957, by which time Sviatoslav assumed full power as Grand Prince. Olga's story, however, has another remarkable chapter. In the 950s, perhaps seeking alliances or a new direction for her people, Princess Olga visited Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. There, according to Byzantine records, she met Emperor Constantine VII, who was reportedly impressed by her intelligence and poise. During this state visit, Olga made a life-changing decision. She converted to Christianity and tried to convince Grand Prince Sviatoslav of the same. He preferred the old gods, and she respected that, and he respected his mom's new faith as well, and allowed her to invite missionaries into the land. It would be Olga's grandson, Vladimir the Great, who eventually baptized the East Slavic people on a large scale, yet Olga's remembered as the pioneering first Christian ruler of the land. For this, she's remembered as Saint Olga, and because this happened before the Great Schism, she's venerated in the Roman Catholic Church as well. Olga's story has all the elements of a cinematic saga, a slain monarch, an unyielding Viking princess, and a ton of plot twists. From the moment Prince Igor fell, Olga's calculating steps ensured that the Drevlians paid dearly for their treachery, and this princess wrote her name in the history books in blood and fire. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, feel free to let me know if there's any epic stories from history you'd like to see me cover in this series in the comments below. Blood stained the altar of Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, Scotland on a cold February day in 1306. Amid flickering candlelight and the shocked gasps of onlookers, Robert the Bruce stood over the fallen body of Sir John Comyn, his rival for the Scottish crown. John the Red, as he was known, lay dying before the high altar. Moments earlier, the two noblemen had met in this sacred space ostensibly to make peace, but their bitter rivalry erupted into violence. Robert's dagger found its mark, and Comyn crumpled to the flagstones, the sanctity of the church shattered by a sin which shocked the entirety of Catholic Europe. Slaying a man in cold blood was grave enough, but doing so inside a church was almost unthinkable. And Sir John was no ordinary victim. He was one of the most powerful lords in the land, a former guardian of Scotland and kinsman of King Edward I of England. With that single desperate strike, Robert the Bruce eliminated his greatest obstacle, but he had also crossed a point of no return. As blood spread across the cold stones, the future of Scotland lurched onto a new, dangerous path. Robert's act of violence did not come out of nowhere. It was born of a long-standing feud in a divided kingdom. After the Scottish King Alexander III died without an heir, England's Edward I intervened and chose John Balliol, Comyn's uncle, over Bruce's grandfather as King of Scots. This planted seeds of enmity between the Balliol-Comyn faction and the Bruce faction. Robert the Bruce and John Comyn were even appointed co-guardians of Scotland during the conflicts against English rule, but their partnership was hostile and short-lived. On one occasion, Comyn reportedly grabbed Robert by the throat in council, a sign of the bitterness and hatred between them, and an act of extreme disrespect. By early 1306, their rivalry had sharpened into deadly intent. According to some accounts, Bruce had secretly offered to trade his estates in exchange for Comyn's support in claiming the crown. Comyn betrayed this potential pact by reporting Robert's plans to King Edward. Whether or not that story is true, Robert clearly believed it, and came to believe that Sir John stood in his way and couldn't be trusted. Thus, Robert arranged a meeting with Comyn at Greyfriars Church in February 1306, ostensibly to resolve their differences, while in truth he was prepared for a one-sided showdown. Inside the dim church, Robert the Bruce confronted Comyn with accusations of treachery, which wasn't exactly what Sir John had signed up for. Their voices echoed off the stone walls as tempers flared. Comyn denied any wrongdoing, allegedly calling Robert a liar. Enraged and cornered, Robert struck, lunging forward and drove his blade into Comyn, cutting the man down before the sanctified altar. The clang of steel and Comyn's gasp of pain shattered the silence. Robert staggered back as his rival collapsed in a pool of blood. Now fully realizing the enormity of what he'd done, spilling blood in a holy sanctuary, he fled out of the church into the daylight. Trembling with adrenaline, he told his waiting allies, "I think I've slain Comyn." Upon hearing this, one of Bruce's knights, Sir Roger de Kirkpatrick, coldly replied that they had to be sure. Kirkpatrick rushed back inside, dagger drawn, and finished the job right inside this holiest of places. In the scuffle, Comyn's uncle was also slain when he tried to intervene. The deed was done. The powerful baron lay lifeless at the altar, and the future King of Scotland had spilled noble blood in the house of God. When King Edward learned that Robert had slain Comyn, he erupted in fury and declared him a traitor and an outlaw, ordering his agents to show no mercy in hunting him down. Pope Clement V, outraged by the sacrilege, excommunicated Robert the Bruce for his crime on holy ground. In a matter of weeks, Robert was transformed from a respected noble into a fugitive with a price on his head. Yet for Bruce, there was no turning back. He had dealt the first blow in a conflict for the Scottish crown, and his only hope now was to seize that crown before England's wrath could crush him. Robert moved quickly to capitalize on the shock of Comyn's removal. With backing from sympathetic churchmen and nobles, he raced to Scone, the traditional coronation site of Scottish kings. Less than 7 weeks after Comyn's demise on March 25th, 1306, Robert the Bruce was crowned King of Scots in a hastily arranged ceremony. Lacking the usual royal regalia, which had been seized by Edward and carried off to England, King Robert's supporters improvised as best they could. According to legend, a noblewoman of the powerful Macduff family volunteered to place the makeshift crown on Bruce's head to legitimize the ceremony. In the eyes of Bruce's allies, the coronation affirmed his claim, but to King Edward it was an intolerable rebellion. The English king promptly dispatched Aymer de Valence, Comyn's brother-in-law, with a formidable army to crush Bruce's revolt. Edward gave strict orders. No mercy whatsoever was to be shown. This was an extermination campaign against Robert the Bruce. The newly minted King Robert had little time to enjoy his title. By the summer of 1306, English forces and vengeful Scottish nobles loyal to Comyn were closing in. In June, just months after his coronation, Robert's small army was caught by surprise at the Battle of Methven. De Valence launched a dawn ambush that overwhelmed the Scots while they were still half asleep in their camp. Robert the Bruce fought fiercely amid the chaos, but his forces were routed. He barely escaped the field with his life, saved by the devotion of a few followers. Robert had expected a fight in the daylight, but his enemy showed no such honor, exploiting darkness and confusion to catch the Scots off guard. This was an understood rule governing conflicts between Christian powers at the time, and some have speculated Robert wasn't aware of Edward's bloody order for revenge. Those captured at Methven, including some of Robert's close allies, were executed as rebels, and Robert suddenly found himself a king without an army. Notably, executing noblemen was absolutely not a common practice at this time for two reasons. The first and official reason was that nobles had the right to lawfully take up arms against their enemies. Simply executing them was considered against morality and decency. The second reason was much more practical. They were worth much more alive, since noblemen could be ransomed, often for a massive sum. With a handful of survivors, Bruce fled west into the mountains, hoping to find refuge and rally new support, but fate dealt him another cruel blow. In August 1306, as Bruce's party traversed the heights of Argyll, they were ambushed at a narrow pass called Dalry by the MacDougall clan. These were kinsmen of the Comyns eager to avenge the Baron's death. Weary and badly outnumbered, the king had roughly 500 men with him at best. Robert's troops were defeated a second time. The king himself was nearly captured. At one point in the fight, MacDougall warriors seized Bruce's cloak and almost dragged him from his horse. Only by swinging his sword with legendary prowess did Bruce cut his way free and escape into the wilderness with a tiny remnant of his followers. The battles of 1306 had turned Robert the Bruce into a king in name, but an outlaw in reality, forced to roam the hills and glens simply to survive. For months, Bruce and his dwindling band wandered the heather-clad highlands as fugitives, cold, hungry, and exhausted, unsure if they would live to see another dawn. Edward's forces scoured the country for Bruce, while the Comyn's allies exacted brutal revenge on his family. One of Bruce's brothers was captured and executed early on. Soon after, two more of his brothers were also seized and put to death, their heads gruesomely displayed on spikes. Bruce's wife, Elizabeth, along with his young daughter and two of his sisters, were captured and handed over to the English. Rather than execute these high-born women, Edward unleashed cruel punishments, presumably intended to force King Robert to surrender himself. Bruce's wife and child were thrown into prison dungeons, put into solitary confinement, and even displayed in cages for public elation. News of these horrors reached Bruce in hiding and must have cut deeply. Everything he cherished was either destroyed, dead, or in the hands of a ruler that history remembers by the title, the Hammer of the Scots. As winter approached, Robert the Bruce vanished into the shadows for a period. This winter of 1306 to 1307 has since become a source of mystery, and has given rise to perhaps the most famous legend about this king. At the time, it was the lowest point in his life, and many thought he was surely finished, and that this story of revenge would ultimately end in Robert fading from history. Yet it was during this bleak exile that a spark of hope famously emerged. In a dank cave on an Irish isle, as one legend tells it, Bruce observed a spider attempting to spin a web. The spider repeatedly failed to swing its thread across a gap, but it refused to give up. At last, the little creature succeeded, achieving its goal through persistence. Inspired by this display of tenacity, Bruce regained his resolve to fight on. Early in 1307, rejuvenated and determined, Robert the Bruce stepped out of the shadows to reclaim his destiny and unleash hell on his English rivals. Robert the Bruce's fortunes began to reverse in 1307. The political landscape shifted in his favor when King Edward I, the fearsome Hammer of the Scots, died in July that year, removing Bruce's greatest nemesis from the board. The English crown passed to Edward II, who proved far less capable of prosecuting the Scottish conflict, and quite ineffective in general. England was thus left in the hands of someone who would have never gotten the position by merit, while the Scottish crown was now controlled by one of the medieval world's great rulers. And to put things in perspective, some believe that the tale of Robert the Bruce was one of the inspirations for Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings. Whether he was or not, the parallels are definitely there, which definitely cannot be said for Edward II. King Robert rallied a band of loyal supporters in the Western Highlands and began a guerrilla campaign against English garrisons and collaborators. He led swift hit-and-run raids, capturing small castles and ambushing enemy detachments. Bit by bit, Bruce reclaimed territory, and in May 1307, he scored a significant triumph over Aymer de Valence at the Battle of Loudun Hill. There, Bruce cleverly chose boggy ground that trapped the charging English knights. Bruce's spearmen overwhelmed the stalled English cavalry, marking his first major victory against the invaders. This battle sent shockwaves through Scotland and England. Robert the Bruce's forces were heavily outnumbered by about 6 men to 1. King Robert proved he had the tactical mind and battlefield prowess to lead men into conflict, and the tenacity to take calculated risks that paid off big. From that point onward, Bruce had started to seize the initiative. Castle by castle and clan by clan, he drove out the English presence. By 1314, English control had crumbled across Scotland, with only Stirling Castle still in enemy hands. That summer, Bruce faced the ultimate test of his warrior kingship, the Battle of Bannockburn. On June 24, 1314, his outnumbered Scottish army met the full might of Edward II's forces, and won decisively. Bruce personally led his men to a stunning victory, crushing the English army and utterly securing all of Scotland's de facto independence. It was the culmination of all his years of struggle. The wrongs inflicted on Robert the Bruce's family and Scotland were avenged on the field of Bannockburn. The invaders who had once hunted King Robert were sent fleeing in defeat. In a final act of revenge, even John Comyn's son, fighting for the English cause, fell in the fray. The victory at Bannockburn made good on the promise of Bruce's coronation and washed away the stain of his earlier failures. In the years that followed, Bruce solidified his realm's independence, and even the Pope eventually lifted his excommunication and recognized him as the rightful king of an independent Scotland. Edward's son Edward III would also go on to recognize Robert the Bruce as the legal and rightful king of a free Scotland. Robert the Bruce had accomplished what many thought impossible. He began his quest in 1306 with an act of violent desperation, the slaying of Comyn, and endured grievous defeats and personal tragedy. Yet through tenacity, courage, and shrewd strategy, he fought back and triumphed. His historic tale is one of epic reversal. The hunted outlaw became the victorious king still revered today, one of Scotland's national heroes. The revenge Robert the Bruce exacted upon his rivals and oppressors secured both his crown and Scotland's freedom and changed the course of history forever. His journey from blood-stained altar to the throne of an independent nation stands as one of history's most dramatic sagas, a true epic of revenge and redemption. On the morning of May 17th, 1606, conspirators stormed the Moscow Kremlin, intent on removing an impostor from the Russian throne. The Tsar, a young man who had held that throne for less than a year, tried to flee, leaping from a window and fracturing his leg in the fall. He was dragged from a bathhouse where he'd tried to hide and was brutally chopped to pieces by a mob of vengeful Russian nobles, known as boyars. His corpse was put on public display, a gruesome warning to all who would challenge the old order. His body was burned, and in a final symbolic act of ultimate rejection, his ashes were loaded into a cannon and fired west, back towards Poland, the land from which this impostor came. This act of extreme desecration begs a question that still echoes through history. Who was this man? Was he, as he and his followers passionately claimed, Tsarevich Dmitri, the youngest son of Ivan the Terrible, miraculously saved from assassins years earlier? Or was he, as his enemies insisted, a charlatan, a runaway monk named Grigory Otrepiev, who perpetrated one of the most audacious frauds in world history? This is the bizarre true story of false Dmitri I, a complete unknown who managed to rise from nothing to the Russian throne. At the turn of the 17th century, Russia was a nation balanced on a knife's edge, a tinderbox of social, political, and spiritual anxieties waiting for a spark. The crisis began with the death of Tsar Ivan IV, better known as the Terrible, in 1584. Ivan's reign had been a study in brutal contradiction. He had forged a powerful, centralized Muscovite state, but he had done so through a reign of terror, the Oprichnina, that shattered the old nobility and left a legacy of paranoia and fear. More disastrously for the kingdom, in a fit of rage, he cut down his eldest son and capable heir, effectively signing the death warrant for his own dynasty. This left the throne to his other son, Fyodor I, a man of weak intellect and feeble constitution, wholly incapable of ruling. With Fyodor's accession, the Rurik dynasty, a line of rulers stretching back over 700 years to the very foundations of the Rus, was ruler in name only. The real power lay with a council of boyars, chief among them Fyodor's ambitious and exceedingly capable brother-in-law, Boris Godunov. The dynasty was teetering, and the entire political structure of Russia was about to come crashing down. The final flickering hope for the Rurik line rested on Ivan the Terrible's youngest son, Dmitry Ivanovich, born from his 7th marriage. This marriage, unlike his previous 6, wasn't recognized by the Orthodox Church as being legitimate. As the power behind Fyodor's throne, Boris Godunov recognized the young Tsarevich as the primary threat to his own ambitions. He acted decisively, exiling the boy Dmitry and his mother's family to the provincial town of Uglich, about 150 miles north of Moscow. There, on May 15, 1591, the 8-year-old Dmitry was found dead in a courtyard. The official investigation, conveniently headed by a prominent boyar, Prince Vasily Shuisky, quickly reached a very suspicious conclusion. And you're going to want to keep this prince's name in mind, because let's just say he's going to be coming up a lot throughout this video. The boy, who was legitimately known to suffer from epilepsy, had experienced a seizure while playing with a knife and had fallen on it, slashing his throat. It was a neat, if somewhat implausible explanation, and for obvious reasons, very few actually believed it. Dmitri's mother and her relatives immediately cried that this was a political assassination, accusing Godunov's agents of eliminating the last true heir. The accusation resonated powerfully across Russia. Godunov was the man who stood to gain the most from the boy's death, and the suspicion was that he had cleared his path to the throne with the death of an innocent. The death at Uglich created a foundational national myth. In the popular imagination, Dmitri became a martyred innocent, and the true Tsarevich would stage a miraculous return and restore order from the chaos that would follow. When the childless and mentally incompetent Tsar Fyodor I finally died in 1598, the Rurik dynasty officially ended. Had young Dmitri still been alive at this time, he almost certainly would have been elevated to the throne, but he was officially deceased, so another method was chosen. A national assembly, the Zemsky Sobor, elected Boris Godunov to the throne. He was a ruler of great skill and intelligence, but he was not of royal blood, and in the rigidly hierarchical world of the Muscovite Tsardom, this was a fatal flaw. The great boyar clans, like the Romanovs and Shuskys, viewed him as a usurper. In response, Godunov ruled with a heavy hand, persecuting his rivals and creating a fearful atmosphere of spies, denunciations, and political purges. To shore up the state's finances and the military service class that was his main base of support, Godunov enacted policies that made him deeply unpopular. He accelerated the process of encirclement, tying peasants more firmly to the land, and imposed heavy taxes on the townsfolk. These measures alienated vast swathes of the population, from the powerful nobles he repressed to the common people he burdened. His legitimacy was paper-thin, resting on an election rather than divine right, and he was widely despised as the man who had stolen the throne from the martyred Dmitri. To make matters worse for Tsar Boris, that legend of Dmitri as a potential rightful savior only grew as his reign became more repressive. Then, an event on the other side of the world sealed Godunov's fate and plunged Russia into utter chaos. In 1600, a volcano named Huayna Putina erupted in Peru. It was one of the most powerful eruptions of the last millennium, ejecting millions of tons of sulfur dioxide and ash into the stratosphere. This created a volcanic winter, a global atmospheric veil that blocked sunlight and caused a dramatic drop in temperatures worldwide. In Russia, the consequences were apocalyptic. The summers of 1601 and 1602 were brutally cold, with frosts occurring even in July and August. The crops failed, not once, but for 3 consecutive years. The result was the Great Famine of 1601 to 1603, the single worst famine in Russian history, and when you're talking about Russian history, this title is no joke. An estimated 2 million people, nearly a third of the entire population, starved to death over these years, and society disintegrated. Landowners, unable to feed their own households, cast out their serfs, sending them to starve. Hordes of desperate, starving people roamed the countryside, and let's just say that near the end, despite all livestock being dead, meat was very much still on the menu. Godunov's government tried to help, distributing grain from state granaries, but the efforts were too little, too late, and only served to bankrupt the treasury. To the Russian people, who had no knowledge of volcanic aerosols or global weather patterns, the explanation for this unprecedented suffering was obvious and terrifying. The famine wasn't a natural disaster, it was an act of God. It was divine punishment for the sins of their illegitimate czar, who came to the throne by sending his hitmen after the last true Rurikid heir. The Tsar had wiped out the consecrated bloodline that had been responsible for the ethnogenesis of the Russian people and for bringing the Orthodox faith to their lands. This belief in Boris as a figure of complete evil utterly destroyed what little legitimacy he had left. As Russia starved and descended into chaos, a charismatic young man appeared in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He carried with him an incredible story. He was Tsarevich Dmitri, son of Ivan the Terrible, and he had miraculously escaped Godunov's assassins in 1591. He was returning to claim his rightful throne from the usurper. The identity of this man remains one of history's great mysteries. Boris Godunov's government immediately launched a propaganda campaign, identifying the pretender as one Grigory Otrepyev. According to this story, he was a runaway monk from a minor noble family who had once served the Romanovs, Godunov's chief rivals. Many historians today accept this identification, believing him to be an exceptionally clever and ambitious impostor. Yet, there's a fascinating and complicating possibility. The man may have sincerely believed he was the Tsarevich. Whether through delusion, indoctrination by others, or even the knowledge that he possessed the hidden truth that he was Dmitri, he played the part of a long-lost royal with conviction. He was well-educated, spoke with a regal air, and even bore a passing resemblance to the young Dmitri. This psychological depth elevates him from a simple con man to a far more compelling historical figure, a man whose self-belief was so powerful it bent reality around him. The pretender found the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to be fertile ground for his ambitions. He assembled a motley coalition of backers, each with their own reasons for supporting his claim. This wasn't a state-sponsored invasion, but rather a privately funded venture, an opportunistic gamble by individuals seeking to profit from Russia's weakness. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a nobles' republic, where the king's power was limited, and great magnates wielded immense influence and commanded their own private armies. He had a number of key supporters in the Commonwealth. Powerful and self-serving nobles saw in Dmitri a golden opportunity for personal enrichment and political influence. Jerzy Mniszek became the pretender's commander-in-chief and, in a masterstroke of cynical ambition, betrothed his 15-year-old daughter, Marina, to the would-be Tsar. Notably, while the king of the Commonwealth wouldn't fully commit to Dmitri, he did provide some funding to him, hoping for a pro-Polish ruler in Moscow. And then there were the Jesuits, who as fervent agents of the Counter-Reformation saw Dmitri as a divine instrument. They hoped to use him to convert Orthodox Russia to Catholicism, bringing the vast realm under the authority of the Pope and creating a united Christian front against the Ottoman Empire. To secure their support, the pretender formally converted to Catholicism in a private ceremony on April 17, 1604. In the fall of 1604, Dmitri crossed the border into Russia at the head of a small army of about 3,500 men, composed mostly of Polish mercenaries. Militarily, the campaign was initially a disaster. Godunov's much larger army met the invaders and defeated them decisively. The pretender's Polish forces began to desert, and the entire enterprise seemed on the verge of collapse. But Dmitri had made a brilliant strategic decision. Instead of a direct assault on Moscow, he had taken a circuitous route through the southern provinces of Russia. These were the very regions most ravaged by famine and most hostile to Godunov's rule. Here, his message found a rapturous audience, and he wasn't seen as a foreign invader, but as a rightful king returning to save his people. Rumors of the true Tsar's arrival spread like wildfire. Disaffected Cossacks, runaway serfs, impoverished gentry, and entire towns rose up and flocked to his banner. What had begun as a failed military invasion was transformed into a massive popular uprising against Godunov. The final obstacle vanished on April 13th, 1605, when Tsar Boris Godunov, ill and despised, suddenly died. With his death, the regime he had built crumbled overnight. His 16-year-old son, Fyodor II, was proclaimed Tsar, but his reign would last only a few weeks. The government army, which had been fighting against Dmitri, promptly switched its allegiance and joined him. In Moscow, the boyars, led by the opportunistic Vasily Shuisky, saw their chance to be rid of the Godunovs forever and brutally snuffed out his entire line. The path was clear, and on June 20th, 1605, the man claiming to be Dmitri made his triumphal entry into Moscow, greeted by ecstatic crowds who saw him as a divine figure. The ultimate act of political theater sealed his legitimacy. The real Dmitri's mother, Maria Nagaya, was brought out from the convent where she had lived for years. Before the assembled people, she tearfully embraced the pretender and publicly recognized him as her long-lost son. On July 21st, he was crowned in the Dormition Cathedral of the Kremlin as Dmitri Ivanovich, Tsar and Grand Prince of all Russia. Tsar Dmitri was a monarch unlike any Russia had ever known. He was young, energetic, charismatic, and shockingly informal, a hip new Tsar for a new generation. He rejected the stiff, almost priestly rituals of the Muscovite court, preferring to walk unescorted through the city and personally oversee the workings of government. He shocked the conservative boyars by appearing clean-shaven and favoring Western-style clothing. For a brief, dizzying 11 months, it seemed as though a new Western European-style era had dawned in Russia. During his short reign, Dmitri embarked on a series of reforms that were remarkably forward-thinking for their time and place. He displayed an ambition that went far beyond simply holding on to power, suggesting a genuine, if perhaps naive, vision for a different kind of Russia. He took immediate steps to address the grievances that had fueled his rise. He restored a system where serfs could legally switch between masters during one narrow window every year, making him very popular with the people. This might not sound like much. They were still serfs after all. But this system had provided some checks on the power of harsh landowners. One couldn't simply exploit one's serfs to the maximum extent possible, because they could just up and leave during that short window in November. He also reversed many of Godunov's political purges, pardoning and restoring the lands and titles of noble families who had been exiled, including the powerful Romanovs. Dmitri dreamed on a continental scale, and his grand project was to form a broad Christian coalition with Poland, the papacy, the Habsburgs, and other European powers. His purpose was to wage a holy war against the Ottoman Empire and free the Balkans from the clutches of the Ottomans. In preparation, he ordered the mass production of modern firearms and began to reorganize the army along Western lines. In his diplomatic correspondence, he even styled himself Emperor of Russia, a title that Peter the Great wouldn't formally adopt for another century. This signaled his desire for Russia and Moscow to be seen as the Third Rome, on equal footing with the great powers of Europe. Despite having converted to Catholicism to win Polish and Jesuit support, Dmitri proved to be a pragmatist in matters of faith. He understood that forcing Catholicism on his deeply Orthodox subjects wouldn't be viable. He refused to grant the Jesuits special privileges or build Catholic churches, angering this influential faction. In a move of startling openness, he even permitted the Catholic and Protestant soldiers in his guard to pray in Orthodox churches. This wasn't viewed as a positive thing by the highly conservative Orthodox priesthood, who viewed this as heresy at best and desecration of holy ground at worst. In hindsight, Dmitri's reign appears as a fascinating historical what-if. He was, in essence, a proto-Westernizer, attempting to implement the kind of military, social, and diplomatic reforms that Peter the Great would later force upon the country. However, his Western dress, his clean-shaven face, his European alliances, and his religious tolerance weren't seen as signs of progress. Instead, they were successfully framed as proof of his foreignness, as evidence of a sinister Polish Catholic plot to subvert the traditions of Russia. While the common people initially adored their charismatic and accessible Tsar, the traditional elites, the boyars, and the Orthodox clergy grew increasingly alarmed. They were alienated by his blatant favoritism towards the Poles, Germans, Scandinavians, and others who filled his court and received prime appointments. The breaking point came in May 1606, with his marriage to the Polish Catholic princess Marina Mniszek. She arrived in Moscow with a large, rowdy, and arrogant Polish entourage that treated the capital as a conquered city. Critically, Marina refused to convert to Russian Orthodoxy before the wedding, a shocking breach of tradition that seemed to confirm the worst fears of the Muscovites. The wedding celebration was intended to be the crowning moment of Dmitri's reign, but instead it became the catalyst for his destruction. The conspiracy that brought down Tsar Dmitri was engineered by a man who was the living embodiment of boyar cynicism and political cunning, Prince Vasily Shuisky, a descendant of the ancient Rurikid princes. He was a master of political survival. His career demonstrates a remarkable talent for opportunistic deception. In 1591, to please the powerful regent Boris Godunov, Shuisky led the investigation that concluded Dmitri had died by accident. However, despite this official story, it was always suspected that he had been the one tasked by Boris with committing this disturbing crime against this innocent party. He was the one who officially told the Russian nobility that the real Dmitri fell on a knife. Yet in 1605, to help overthrow the Godunov dynasty, he completely reversed his story, swearing that Dmitri had survived and that the pretender was the legitimate heir to the throne. Then, shortly after Dmitri was crowned, Shuisky was caught plotting against him. The new Tsar, in a display of either magnanimity or foolishness, pardoned him from the executioner's block and allowed him to return to court. Shuisky repaid this kindness by immediately starting a new conspiracy, one that would ultimately have him declared Tsar himself. The week-long wedding festivities in May 1606 provided the perfect opportunity for the conspirators. Moscow seethed with resentment at the thousands of Polish guests who swaggered through the streets, flouting local customs. Shuisky and his allies capitalized on this xenophobia, spreading a terrifying rumor. Tsar Dmitri was about to unleash his Polish guards on the people of Moscow, locking the city gates and commencing a massacre of the Russian populace. On the morning of May 17th, the conspirators rang the great alarm bell, the traditional signal for a popular uprising. Shuisky rode into Red Square, holding a cross and declaring that the time had come to defend the Orthodox faith against the heretic on the throne. A mob of boyars, their armed retainers, and enraged citizens stormed the Kremlin. Dmitri was swiftly slain, and the violence ended up spreading into a xenophobic pogrom against all foreigners in Moscow, with a particular focus on Poles and Catholics. The elimination of false Dmitri didn't end the time of troubles, not even close, and in fact, as we will see, it didn't even eliminate the concept of false Dmitris. Rather, it plunged Russia deeper into the abyss, and Shuisky's reign was illegitimate from the start, and the crown that lay on his head would soon lay heavy enough to fracture his neck. The assassination of the first false Dmitri didn't put to rest the idea of Dmitri the Savior. The myth of the true Tsar had become a self-sustaining political force, a symbol of opposition so powerful that it no longer needed a credible vessel. In August 1607, a second impostor, false Dmitri II, appeared in southern Russia. This new pretender, believed to have been a priest's son or a teacher, bore no physical resemblance to his predecessor, but it didn't matter. He claimed to be Tsar Dmitri, miraculously rescued from the 1606 massacre, and that was enough. Now, personally, I know this guy is called False Dmitri II by historians, but I would actually call him False Dmitri I, given what he was claiming. And trust me, Dmitriception isn't going to be ending anytime soon. This version of Dmitri quickly amassed a huge army of Cossacks, Polish adventurers, and all who were disaffected with Shusky's rule. He marched towards Moscow and established a rival court, a shadow government, in the village of Tushino, just outside the capital's walls. In a moment of supreme political theater that bordered on the surreal, Marina Menishek, the widow of the first false Dmitri, was brought to the Tushino camp. In a purely transactional and cynical act to reclaim her status as Tsarina, she publicly quote-unquote recognized this total stranger as her miraculously saved husband. The Dmitri phenomenon was no longer about a specific person. It was an I am Spartacus moment for everyone standing against the current order. Or I suppose you could say I am Demetrius given the context. Russia now had two czars, two governments, and two armies, and the country disintegrated into a brutal civil conflict. Desperate, Tsar Shusky made a fateful alliance with Sweden, promising territorial concessions in exchange for military aid to fight this second false Dmitri. This foreign intervention gave Poland's King Sigismund III the pretext he had been waiting for. Viewing the Russo-Swedish alliance as a threat, he declared war on Russia in 1609, and this time he invaded with the full might of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This was one of the most powerful states in Europe at the time, at least, when its nobles could be corralled to a common cause. However, this was a bit like herding a group of cats. An alliance between Russia and Sweden deeply threatened the powerful nobles of the Commonwealth, and Moscow became a big tuna for the Polish cat to feast upon. What had begun as a private adventure had now escalated into a full-scale international conflict for the soul of Russia. As is often the case in Russian history, the chaos only deepened from there. False Dmitri II was eliminated by one of his own followers in December 1610. Shusky was deposed by his own boyars and forced into a monastery. Polish forces defeated the Russian army and occupied Moscow itself. A third false Dmitri even made a brief appearance in 1611. But just like with The Godfather Part 3, this one didn't quite hit the same. The third one received an even more disappointing sequel, known as False Dmitri IV. This final false Dmitri may have just been the third false Dmitri, recorded by different sources the next year. The Russian state had effectively gone extinct, consumed by an invasive proliferation of its numerous Dmitris. It was only then, with the nation on the verge of total collapse and under foreign occupation, that a true national resistance finally emerged. A new army came together and was able to oust the Poles from Moscow in 1612. In 1613, a great national assembly elected Michael Romanov as the new Tsar. His family name, which will be familiar to most fans of history, may signal to you that this one would be a bit different. Michael Romanov would signal the end of the times of trouble and the establishment of a dynasty that would last into the 20th century. The question of who the first false Dmitri really was remains a great unsolved mystery of history. The answer is in essence a complete unknown, and there are as many theories out there as there are scholars on this period of history. However, he was fully literate and spoke French fluently, indicating that he came from at least a high noble background. Importantly, Some subscribe to the theory that false Dmitri wasn't so fake at all. As you'll recall, Prince Vasily Shuisky, the one who ruled that the real Dmitri was dead, changed his story numerous times over the years. In a dark twist, some historians believe that the prince had his men hunt down a peasant boy who looked like the real Dmitri and eliminated him. Under this theory, the real Dmitri's mother had him sent away for his safety. Prince Shuisky, not wanting to get executed for this blunder, then presented the body of the unfortunate peasant boy to Boris Godunov. As for the legacy of the first false Dmitri, the evidence suggests a complicated figure. While he was undeniably dependent on Polish support, he was no one's pawn. He skillfully resisted the demands of his backers, refusing to cede Russian territory or force Catholicism upon his people, much to the frustration of his supporters. He was an intelligent, ambitious, and surprisingly capable ruler who, in his brief time in power, attempted genuine reforms that hinted at a more open future for Russia. He can be seen as a tragic figure, a would-be reformer whose vision was utterly incompatible with the deeply traditional society he sought to lead. His story is that of a man tragically out of his time, whose own cultural missteps and the ruthless ambition of the boyar elites led to his violent end. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy, just taking a moment to remind you to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family, as well as any Dimitris in your life.